the 1750s, British possessions and trade reached around the globe. Every part of the world affects us in some way or another, remarked one English commentator. The existence of global empires implied that warfare among them would also be global. What became a worldwide struggle for imperial domination, which eventually spread to Europe, West Africa, and Asia, actually began in 1754, when British efforts to dislodge the French from forts they had constructed in western Pennsylvania and the Ohio River Valley. In the previous year, George Washington, then only 21 years old, had been dispatched by the colony's governor and on an unsuccessful mission to persuade the French soldiers to abandon a fort they were building on lands claimed by the Ohio Company. In 1754, Washington returned to the area with 2 companies of soldiers. He hastily constructed Fort Necessity after realizing that the French presence at Fort Duquesne was much larger than his own. After an ill-considered attempt to defend it against the larger French force, as well as their Indian allies, Washington was defeated. He was forced then to surrender. Soon afterwards, an expedition led by General Edward Braddock against the same position by the French was ambushed by French and Indian forces, leaving Braddock and 2/3 of his 3,000 soldiers dead or wounded. 2 years, or I should say for 2 years, the war went on between the British and the French. The French and Indian forces during the first 2 years captured British forts in northern New York. The southern backcountry, or frontier, was ablaze with fighting among British soldiers, colonists, and Indians. Inhumanity flourished on all sides. Indians killed hundreds of colonists in western Pennsylvania and pushed the line of settlement all the way back to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is only about 100 miles west of Philadelphia. In Nova Scotia, the British rounded up around 5,000 local French residents, called Acadians, and confiscated their land, and expelled them from the region, selling their farms to settlers from New England. Some of those expelled eventually returned to France. Others ended up as far away as Louisiana. When William Pitt took control of the British government in 1757, things began to change for the British struggles against the French. Pitt raised huge sums of money and poured men and naval resources into the war against the French, and the tide of the battle began to turn. Pitt's strategy was to provide funds to Prussia and Austria to enable them to hold the line against the French in Europe, while the British struck at the French's weak point, which was in the American colonies. By 1759, Britain, with colonial and Indian soldiers playing a major role, captured the pivotal French outpost of Fort Duquesne, Ticonderoga, and Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, which guarded the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. In September of that year, a French army was defeated on the Plains of Abraham near Quebec City. In 1760, Montreal, the last outpost of New France, surrendered, marking the defeat of the French during the 7 Years' War. As long as the world has stood, there has not been such a war, declared a British emissary to the Delaware Indians. Britain's victory fundamentally reshaped the world balance of power. The Peace of Paris in 1763 confirmed the end of the 7 Years' War and British victory and possession of the new continental empire. At the Peace of Paris in 1763, French ceded Canada to Britain, receiving in return just a few sugar islands in the Caribbean. As part of the reshuffling of imperial possessions, Spain also ceded Florida to the British in exchange for the return of the Philippines and Cuba. Spain also acquired from the French, defeated during the 7 Years' War, the vast Louisiana colony. France's 200-year-old North American empire had come to an end. With the exception of 2 tiny islands retained by France off the coast of Newfoundland, the entire continent east of the Mississippi River was now in British hands. Peace Pitt, will be as hard to make as war. 18th century warfare conducted on land and sea across the globe was enormously expensive. The 7 Years' War put strains on all of the participants. The war's costs produced a financial crisis in France that almost 3 decades later would help spark the French Revolution. The British would try to regroup part of the cost of war by increasing taxes on their American colonies. In fact, the Peace of Paris was soon followed by open warfare in North America between the British and the Native American inhabitants. It is a conflict more popularly known as Pontiac's Rebellion, but should probably be called the First War of Independence, or the Indian Uprising of 1763. Throughout eastern North America, the abrupt departure of the French in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War eliminated the balance of power diplomacy that enabled many native groups like the Iroquois to maintain a significant degree of autonomy. Even as England and its colonies celebrated their victory as a triumph of liberty, Indians saw it as a threat to their own freedom. Native Americans had fought on both sides of the war, although many allies of the French. Their primary aim, however, was to maintain their independence from both the French and the British. Domination by any outside power Indians feared meant the loss of freedom. Without consulting them, the French had ceded lands in the Ohio River Valley, lands that Indians claimed as their own. The Treaty of Paris left Indians more dependent than ever on the British and ushered in a period of confusion over land claims, control of the fur trade, and tribal relations in general. To Indians, it was clear that the continued expansion of the British colonies possessed a dire threat to their existence. And without the French there to act as allies and to buffer the English, they knew that they were in trouble. One British Army officer reported that Native Americans, quote, say we mean to make slaves of them by taking their land. Perhaps that wasn't too far from the truth. In 1763, in the wake of the French defeat, Indians of the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region launched a revolt against British rule. Although known as Pontiac's Rebellion after an Ottawa war leader, the rebellion owed at least as much to the teachings of Neolin, a Delaware religious prophet, as it did to Pontiac. During a religious vision, the Master of Life instructed Neolin, the Delaware prophet, that his people must reject European technology, free themselves from commercial ties with the whites and dependence on alcohol, clothe themselves in the garb of their ancestors, and drive the British from their territory. Neolin combined this message with the relatively new idea of a pan-Indian identity. All Indians, he preached, were a single people, and only through cooperation could they gain their lost independence. The common experience of dispossession, the intertribal communities that had developed in the Ohio country, and the mixing of Indian warriors in French armies had helped to inspire this sense of identity as Indians rather than as members of individual tribes. In the spring and summer of 1763, Ottawa, Huron, and other Indians, led by this vision, besieged Detroit, then a major British outpost, seized 9 other British forts, and killed hundreds of white settlers who had intruded onto Indian lands. British forces soon launched a counterattack, and over the next few years, the tribes, one by one, made peace. But the spring inspired the government of London to issue something called the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited further colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. These lands were reserved exclusively for Indians. Moreover, the proclamation banned the sale of Indian lands to private individuals and companies like the Ohio Company. Henceforth, only colonial governments could arrange such purchases. The British aim was less to protect the Indians than to stabilize the situation on the colonial frontier and to avoid being dragged into an endless series of borderland conflicts. but the proclamation enraged both settlers and speculators hoping to take advantage of the expulsion of the French to consolidate their claims to western lands. They ignored the new policy, that is, the proclamation of 1763. George Washington himself ordered his agents to buy up as much Indian land as possible while keeping the transactions, quote, a profound secret because of their illegality. Failing to offer a viable solution to the question of westward expansion, the proclamation line of 1763 ended up further exacerbating settler-Indian relations. Like the Indians, colonists emerged then from the 7 Years' War with a heightened sense of collective identity. Before the war, as pointed out, the colonies had largely been isolated from one another. Participation in the 7 Years' War created general bonds among the colonies, but the war also strengthened colonist pride in being members of the British Empire. It had been said that Americans were never more British than in 1763. Colonial militiamen and British regulars fought alongside each other against the French. Tensions developed between professional British military and often undisciplined American citizen soldiers, but the common experience of battle and victory during the 7 Years' War forged bonds between them. For much of the century, New Englanders had called for the conquest of Canada as a blow for Protestant freedom against Popish slavery of New France. Now that this had been accomplished, British victory in the 7 Years' War deemed a triumph of liberty over tyranny. The defeat of the Catholic French reinforced the equation of British nationality, Protestantism, and freedom. In fact, however, by 1763, Britain's global empire was neither predominantly Protestant, nor British, nor free. But soon, the American colonists would come to believe that membership in the empire jeopardized their liberty. When they did, they set out on a road that led to independence.